Good afternoon again, everyone. We have what I think is an outstanding panel with us to close the session this afternoon. Three individuals, two of which I know well. One is a new acquaintance, but we have an excellent set of three speakers. What we will do is we will go through the presentations, I think, in sequence, then bring our panelists up to the front and do an open round of questions and discussions with all of us together. Our first speaker this afternoon is Franny Lautier. I had the great pleasure and honor to be at the World Bank during part of Franny's tenure at the bank. She is currently the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation. Among her other positions prior to this, she was the Vice President of the World Bank for the World Bank Institute. And I think myself and many others share the deep feeling that Franny's tenure in that position really placed the World Bank Institute in a very new and very dynamic context in regard to capacity building and training and helping to position the World Bank Group in particular as a voice, I think, for the low-income countries. So it is a great pleasure to have Franny with us here today. And with that, I will introduce you, please.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the World Bank, the UN, and Columbia University for this invitation and opportunity to discuss topical issues. My presentation will be picking a few of the things that Dr. Lin put on the table, but perhaps with a different twist in terms of the African perspective and some of the research that we've been doing at the African Capacity Building Foundation. We've already heard about the least developed countries and why we are putting so much attention on them. But while they represent 12% of the global population, the interests we have is that the majority of them are in Africa. So if we don't have a solution for economic growth and poverty reduction in Africa, we are not going to solve the LDC problem. And as mentioned before, not only are the countries having high levels of poverty, but they have dependency on agriculture. And therefore, if we follow what Dr. Lin put on the table in terms of the endogenous opportunities for transformation, then agriculture would have to be one of the sectors that drives that transformation. And the link between that and the export industry and the export business in general has a lot of implications, and the trade environment is binding in that regard. So it links to all the issues that came on the table: infrastructure, the climate change, deforestation, and so on. And then there is the question of transforming while you are vulnerable. That can make you either stronger or even more vulnerable. So the issues you need to have in place, the capabilities in order to be resilient, are issues that I will cover in my talk. And then amongst the set of capabilities are the capability to adapt, which is a key capability, not only in terms of climate change, but in general. So what are the key starting points for that, and how do we move forward? And then, of course, we have challenges. We are now looking at what has happened to least developed countries after the financial crisis. And one of the factors we have uncovered in the case of Africa, more than 40% of the countries had high economic growth but very high unemployment. So economic growth was jobless. And this is a big question, because if you're going to go down through a path of structural transformation, then that transformation has to incorporate job creation. And I think the type of growth that countries go through will be key. And then, of course, we know that Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent. This is true for LDCs in general. And also, there are a number of depletion points that countries are reaching in terms of natural resources. How do we sustain economic growth in that context? How do we transform agriculture? How do we guarantee food security as we go down the path of structural transformation? And then, of course, we have the question of technology and business shocks, because during these last 50 years, we've had a number of technological shocks that have transformed the way we think about business, the way we think about social interaction, or even governance. Look at the role, for instance, of communications technologies on the continent, and they've had a huge implication. So integration challenges to get more effective trade comes with benefits and challenges as well. But we do know that that's one of the key ways in which the continent and other LDCs can contribute more effectively by looking at opportunities for trade. So the world before the financial crisis was a very optimistic one for most of the LDCs, but particularly for Africa, because there was progress on the economic front. There were variations across countries, but in general, most of the countries reported significantly higher economic growth numbers. Why? They had put in place solid and prudent macroeconomic policies, and they pursued those consistently. So the question is, why did that not generate jobs, and why did that not reduce poverty as much as we hoped? The other positive trend was the diaspora. We have seen that the remittances were quite high, that the diaspora had more trust in their countries of origin than the private sector in general, because FDI went to places where the remittances did not go, and remittances went to places where FDI did not go. So you ask, what did diaspora know about investing in their countries of origin that could drive transformation that the private sector through FDI could use as an opportunity, and vice versa? And so in the post-crisis world, we notice again countries have resumed growth. Almost every country is growing as fast or sometimes faster than it was in 2007. The question is how to get jobs and development out of that growth, sustaining that growth, and reducing the challenges that come with the contraction that is taking place in other parts of the world, which is impacting countries that had taken an export-led strategy for development. So there are a number of questions and suggestions that people have put on the table, saying what needs to be done in LDCs for LDCs to really be able in the next 20 years to overcome all these challenges. Many people talk about resilience, so we'll talk a bit this afternoon about what we see as the fundamentals of resilience, where are countries and what are the remaining challenges. There's the question of the policy environment. Which policies? Because if we are going to follow the new structural economics, then maybe there's a different set of policies we have to think about and not the business as usual. What sources of growth and how to support potential in this public-private interface that is so important in this new structural economics. And then the dependency issues, because risks of dependency on natural resources are there. And we know that the majority of countries have not followed a balanced growth approach. They've relied too much on the natural resources. And then there are questions of infrastructure, which were mentioned earlier, and how they link not only to the agricultural sector, but to the broad development overall. And I'll perhaps leave a few stories on what we see as opportunities in the service sector for LDCs, particularly when you think about innovation and job creation, and how one can tap into the diaspora to bring such ideas and capacities to the fore. So we know resilience is built over time, and we know that there are ways in which you can judge the degree to which countries are resilient. We look at the issues that also came up strongly in the Istanbul platform: ownership, is one. Capabilities to put in place the right policy environment is another. But also is the ability to own, develop, and agree on a common vision and a strategy. If that is not in place, we can forget about all of these wonderful options that we think could be in place. We notice that there has been improvement. We'll show some numbers, but there's also deterioration in some areas that are worrisome, and we need to put attention on those areas in the coming years. Progress has been seen in stability and growth on the continent, but the risk of falling into fragility still remains high. And many countries are growing faster than they were before, but we need to focus on policies that secure that growth and that bring opportunities in those that are still lagging. Why did I mention resilience and fragility in the same sentence or same slide? Because some of the research we have done indicates that there are at least 4 things that can cause countries that are doing very well and making their way into the path of secure, stable, and equitable growth to fall back into fragility. The 4 things are results. If you have economic growth and the average citizen does not see what it means for them, it is not sustainable. Tunisia, Egypt are recent examples. Ownership, because ownership underpins legitimacy, and if it's not there, then it's not sustainable. Inclusion, if people feel left out, whether it's in the discussion about the future or in the benefits from growth, it is not sustainable. And of course, the very important role of institutions, because for a state that is proactive, that state depends on stable and highly effective institutions. So where are we now? These are the results for Africa. 78% of countries have very low results. So we know if we don't push up the barrier and break through in terms of delivery of services, that even the countries that are now growing very fast, that growth is not going to lead to stability. The good news, ownership has improved. This is the legitimacy of national strategies. And you see that it's a sustained growth 1 year after the other. And that is very good news. Institutions, we've seen institutions have become more sophisticated in embedding incentives for performance, but the one worrisome feature is the adaptability, flexibility to deal with shocks, to deal with all these challenges of choosing in an uncertain world. And those flexibilities still have to be built. So the challenge for institutions going forward is going beyond incentives and to build in adaptability and flexibility. Now, I was struck by this result. When you look at the wealth level of natural resource-rich countries, and you look at them in 2013 compared to 2007, so after the crisis, you see that countries that are projected to grow more than 7% in 2013 compared to 2007 are also in very big mixes of wealth, per capita income or per capita GDP in particular, because that's the figure we use here. And then those that are projected to also grow slower at less than 4% are also quite a diverse mix. So what this tells us is that the natural resource wealth and the existing level of production capacity are not guarantees for the ability to either grow faster or even reduce poverty. So it goes, I think it gives more credence and strong evidence that we have to look at some of the things that Dr. Lin was talking about earlier on. The other one is policies. What is worrisome is you notice that the capacity to put good policy in place is quite high. But comparing 1 year after the other, you see a slight decline. And this is a bit of a worry. You look, for instance, at countries like Kenya, they put price controls during the food crisis when the prices were very high. Tanzania put export bans for food moving from Tanzania to neighboring countries. There are a number of policies like this that constrain the capability of neighbors, and they even constrain the capability of countries. So the capacity is there to put the policies in place. The question is whether the capacity is there to sustain good policies such that they can deliver results. The other driver, we look at these two legs, a capable state and a dynamic private sector. Where is the private sector in Africa? These are the top 500 countries. They're highly concentrated. You see the long list of countries that have less than 5 companies that are in this top 500, which is the dynamo for innovation, for scale, and for generating the second leg of development that can accompany the state in generating development. So that is one of the questions. If we are going to have this two-step process with a competitive, dynamic environment where the private sector and individual ingenuity can drive, accompanied by a capable state, we still have issues to worry about in a number of countries. But where are these companies? And this is the question of, if you are to pick those fast-growing, dynamic sectors, where are they now? Good news, most of them are in agribusiness. So it looks like Africa is actually walking down that path of growing dynamic capability, manufacturing, value chains in agriculture, which are part of this agribusiness. Yet it's also picking up telecoms, mining, petroleum services, and so on. So it's on the right path in going down that transformation and diversification of the growth sources. But when you look at where there are less than 10 companies in the whole of Africa, I'd point to engineering, only 5. How can Africa build the infrastructure networks that it needs without the engineering skill? When you look at the transformation in things like water, very critical sector, only 4 top companies. So the challenges in going down this path would require looking very broadly across the sectors. There's another question, which is size. The majority of companies by turnover are very small, so they're still in the SME category if you benchmark them globally. And so the question of going up the scale of growth in size is also important. Most of the countries that are naturally resource rich have some risks from that dependency. One has to do with the patterns of revenue and spending, and one would have to look at the capabilities of the state to manage that transformation, to protect and be more resilient to the volatility of world prices, to put in place investment competitiveness in sectors outside the natural resource area. And so there's a long list of policies and capabilities that need to be in place in order for that to happen. Simple things like reviewing public expenditures and avoiding boom and bust cycles, focusing on revenue collection and so on, which are important capabilities that need to be strengthened. What we worry most about is that when you look at some of the countries, they have already reached the depletion point of the natural resources. So those natural resources, look at a country like Gabon, and the oil production, the change between 2007 and 2013 is negative. So the dependency sometimes on a natural resource, when you get to the depletion point and you have not generated equitable growth, would be a problem. So what we look at not only is the capacity to generate growth from those natural resources, but also watching that depletion point so that the time to diversify into something else can also be taken into account. And then, of course, you have the issues of displaced labor, absorbing people into new industries and so on, which require a very capable state. And finally, during the process of extraction itself, economic governance is fundamental because that's the driver for equitable use of those revenues. Then, of course, there's infrastructure. These are the estimated numbers. They're very big numbers, the level of investment needed to get infrastructure in the low-income countries and the fragile and non-fragile states combined. The capabilities that are needed to make these investments valuable, first of all, have to do with multi-country agreements, contracts across countries for energy, for example, regional transport networks that share infrastructure, border crossings, and so on. Water-level supplies that are specific to a given country but with shared resources across countries. And then, of course, we've seen already the impact of regional ICT and how that has transformed East Africa, for instance, as an example. Agriculture. If we are to use agriculture to transform the structure of Africa's economies, these are the countries ranked from the lowest to the highest agricultural capacity. And let me go into what is underpinning those capabilities. In the interest of time, I'm skipping some of the slides, but the capabilities that go through devising and coming up with these composite measures of capability in agriculture have to do with resources available to the sector, a strategy that allows the country to really exploit agriculture for growth and poverty reduction, science and technology, innovation and information systems, and so on. So this tells you that there's still a lot of work to do, even in the agricultural sector, to go from subsistence to a more complex and sophisticated sector. Then we have jobs in general. And the worrisome factor is that not only do we know that there is a challenge for job creation, but we have some challenges in actually knowing in which jobs, in which sectors we've created jobs, because the databases are very poor. So you look at the countries in terms of the level of unemployment, and you see that the majority of countries are between moderate and low. But almost a quarter of the countries, there is no data available to say anything about that. So if we are to transform the economies of least developed countries, we have to focus on the data question. So we know where are people employed, what is moving, and what are the changes that are taking place on a day-to-day basis. This gives that story in a bit more graphic detail. You look at the top countries in terms of unemployment from 9% to 28%, and you look at the changes between 2001 and 2008, and where it's negative, it means they've succeeded in reducing unemployment, which means all of them. However, you look at the status then in 2009, we always assume that there should be learning as you try to go down the path of dealing with a crisis like job creation. And you see a number of countries with no data, therefore you can't tell whether it has worked or not. And then some that have actually deteriorated from a moderate unemployment to high unemployment. So it tells us that we still have a lot of work to do in this area. What lessons do we draw just from the job environment itself? One is that labor market analysis is critical. We need data for that. But that data has to come quickly, so that if you are transforming the structure of your economy, you actually are starting from a benchmark and you know where you're going. And this is a critical area for bridging very quickly for us to make progress. If we are going to tap into what Dr. Lin highlighted as the unique capabilities and the latent comparative advantages, one of the opportunities for that comes in self-created work, because a lot of innovation can take place when you have a weak state by individual ingenuity, especially where you don't have high coordination costs, you don't need infrastructure, and you can manage with very limited trade. And that tends to be things like fishing, but it also tends to be things like very high-skilled jobs that are created by individuals. So education is a driver for this. For example, look at banking, look at finance, look at management. All of these are high-skill areas, but they don't need, in a small controlled environment like, say, microfinance, very high coordination costs. So you could imagine a very important high-skill area that generates jobs, but it's driven by the education sector. Other unique skill jobs come from culture. And those are very difficult to imitate because it takes centuries to figure out somebody's culture. Handicrafts, art, music, dance, and so on. And then, of course, research and analysis, because that is between two ears. It's the most individualized capability. And countries don't need much to be doing research and analysis, especially in today's world. But we need math, we need science, we need high-end analytical skills. Again, back to the education sector. Agriculture. You could raise a lot of productivity in agriculture by introducing technology and sophisticating the sector. Because as you do that, the value added as a share of GDP could grow. But again, we need science and technology, we need regional markets, and we need entrepreneurs as farmers. And this is a key capability that we need to put in place. And that has a policy underbelly with it. The example of latent capabilities and latent comparative advantage, I thought to bring this image of an old artist who is painting the picture cut of a young girl who was a 6-year-old was watching over his shoulder. Because there is a latent capability that comes in tacit knowledge, and how that tacit knowledge gets transferred from one generation to the other. Because underlying that are all sorts of things like the discovery and early scientific thinking, the pharmaceuticals, which are linked to a number of practices that are not yet documented and can be high comparative advantage for countries that have been practicing that. You look at Ayurvedic medicine in India and how that quickly became a global business because it was such a unique way of looking at the total body and the implication it had on medicine. There are many other examples that are in ecology, agricultural tourism that go in that direction. And these cannot be copied because they are location specific, they are culture specific. And for such employment to succeed, you need access to skills, you need marketing, you need finance, so it still depends on some of these complex capabilities that are needed in the competitive institutions and an energized state. Construction is the other one. The building you see here was built way back in the 12th century. They were constructing like this. What is interesting is not much has changed since then. But what has remained in terms of the skill can actually be scaled up multiple-fold to build, for instance, under waves of flooding and areas that are going to be unstable with climate change. So how you take a sector that is as modern as construction and embed some of these techniques that have helped generations to live in comfortable situations requires you to have a vocational skill development program, ability to bridge intermediate jobs with more permanent jobs, and the link between very basic skills and deep engineering skills. And all of that then support a complex industry such as construction. And construction, when you look today at China, which has been constructing in Africa now in the last almost 20 years, if we follow the logic of the increasing labor costs, the next opportunity for breakthrough in terms of construction techniques will come from the LDCs. And those will be very opportunistic areas to go, particularly as we think about climate change, as we think about opportunities to use new materials, sustainable materials, because that's something that is still being used today in LDCs. Negotiating aid will be key. I left here only two examples, the World Bank and China. They're the biggest investors in infrastructure in Africa. Of course, there's the African Development Bank. But if one is going to be able to succeed, then negotiating aid and making sure the aid can go towards these forms of structural transformation will be the key. Because at the moment, that is not where countries are at the moment. They don't have, the majority of countries don't have the capabilities to negotiate an aid package that would allow them to transform their economies. So this remains a capability to be built. Brain drain is the last area I wanted to end with before I conclude. We did a very quick analysis looking at what have people who have left Africa done and how have the countries responded over the years in terms of dealing with people who are leaving the countries. And we found countries fall into 4 categories. There are countries that have succeeded to increase and improve their capacities, improving the capabilities of their training institutions, their ability to retain talent, but also ability to bring back talent. So we call those countries that can develop and buy. And then you have other countries that have developed so much skill and talent that they cannot use it themselves at the current level of economic development. So they keep most of it, but they sell, quote unquote, the rest to other countries. So this is the brain drain phenomenon, or people leaving to go and work elsewhere. But then you have 2 categories of countries, those that have not developed their own capabilities and mostly buy from outside, technical assistance and so on, and those that develop their capabilities but they can't use them for various reasons, instability, very weak capacity to use highly skilled people, and they mostly sell. So they're generating for the global labor market, you could say. And what you notice is that there are very few countries in this quadrant where you either develop and buy or develop and sell. And to transform an economy, particularly going through the manufacturing and service side with the high-end skills, would require us to help most countries migrate to that environment. But this requires capabilities beyond just developing people, but making sure they can be retained, utilized effectively, and generate results. So in conclusion, the priorities for LDCs need to go towards resilience to shocks. That means better preparedness, but also appropriate responses. Food security will remain a key issue, so we cannot go through any alternative without looking at agriculture and agricultural productivity. But the value chain in agriculture is a good opportunity to start making that transformation. And that can be done while worrying about nutrition, because some of the agriculture value chains are for non-food products, and that creates temporary risks for countries. Improved access to services will be a good way to stabilize countries that could risk falling into fragility, so we need to pay attention to that. But also to make sure that high economic growth, particularly for the natural resource-rich countries, really generates jobs and reduces poverty. We need to pay attention to governance. We call it particularly the economic and financial governance, because that is how you get a proactive state to accompany a competitive environment. But finally, you cannot move far without focusing on capacity. Capacity for countries to be able to transform their societies and economies, to increase not only production but productivity, but to have the knowledge, the skills and the spaces in which they can enhance learning and implementation, so that you get a dynamic, adaptable capacity for societies to really be resilient and generate growth that would reduce poverty and create jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franny. That was a very comprehensive and I think outstanding way to open the panel. And I know there'll be a number of questions, including some that I was thinking about, the link between growth and employment that we were speaking about earlier, which is, of course, a key, very key factor for growth ahead for the least developed countries. Let's now turn to our second panelist, Leonce Dicumana. He is the Andrew Glynn Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He is also an honorary professor of economics at the University of Stellenbosch. Among his other positions over the past number of years, he's also served as Director of Operational Policies and Director of Research at the African Development Bank. So eminently well qualified to speak to us about issues related to the least developed countries, in particular in Africa. So with that, Dr. Dicumana, please.
While this is with finding the presentation, I want to just I want to take the time to thank the organizers of the conference, the UN, Columbia University, the World Bank, APEC, for inviting me to be part of this panel. Very illuminating. I think if we think about where Africa is heading, where Africa is likely to be in the next decade, this is the way to think about it. Structural transformation. We need to think creatively, new, fresh ideas. Can't find it. Is that that's one? Yeah. Yeah, that's the one. So what I will do is hopefully contribute to the debate that was very well, for which the framework was well done with by the chief economist of the World Bank and my colleague from the ACBF. By focusing on Africa, which, as you have heard, comprises a large number, if not the majority, of less developed countries. So, issues in Africa are really paramount to the questions that these developing countries are facing. Now, if you have been since you have been following the many reports, I just heard one which I haven't seen, which I'm looking forward to see, that the World Bank has just released, is that there is a lot of good news coming out of Africa in terms of economic performance. The headlines are quite encouraging and sometimes even exuberant. We have seen new stories about success stories. In the past, we used to think of success stories only limited to Mauritius, South Africa, Botswana. But in an interesting report done by the World Bank called Yes, Africa Can, there are 26 case studies which are very, very much enlightening in terms of what kind of possibilities that African countries have to achieve. There's a case study on Mali that documents success in export in the mango sector. Rwanda is doing amazing progress in terms of in the coffee sector, moving up the value chain. ICT is developing really fast in Africa, giving hope that Africa can actually leapfrog in terms of technology. The McKinsey report, was it 2010, was talking about African lions on the move, and the point was that African countries are growing faster. That's the idea of quickened economic pulse. Commercial viability, in the sense that African countries actually are a growing market. So if you think about industrialization, transformation, there is a market in Africa already that can be tapped on. And we know that before the financial crisis, even financial institutions in the developed world were looking at Africa as a destination for investment. So, and the evidence will tell you that returns to investment are much higher in Africa than in the developed world, especially now, where you get 0.25% on your deposits in the West. Looking closely, as the presentation before has documented, there are some concerns. We should not celebrate yet that we have achieved. Growth can be increased. It's still not enough to reduce poverty. There are many major constraints that need to be dealt with, even as we know that there are opportunities which need to be tapped. And the key, again, is to devise a strategy for sustainable but equitable growth and structural transformation, and that's really the key focus of this conference. Now, what we see today as high growth in Africa is actually not new. When you take the long view, and if you really think about structural transformation, it's not something that happens in 2 years, something that happens over the long term. So Africa is posting high growth rate, but it has done that before. And the question is, are we going to stay on the upward slope, or is the next decade going to resemble the lost decade? Hopefully not, and certainly not, especially looking at what Dr. Lotti was pointing at, which is improved capacity to implement policies. If you look at how governments in Africa responded to the crisis, it was impressive. Responded quickly, prudently, but that helped in terms of weathering the storm. So I'm almost sure that we won't see another sequence of lost decades in Africa, which would be dramatic in terms of development. But again, if we take the long view, there are important structural challenges that African countries face: divergence, slow capital accumulation, lack of structural transformation. This is where we're going to focus, but also high volatility of growth. I will illustrate this with reference to agriculture. But as we celebrate higher growth, we need not forget that this growth has not been shared. It has been unequally shared, and inequality, to me, is one of the constraints that has limited the gains from growth in terms of poverty reduction. So inequality is something that we need to tap into. Now, there is, of course, diversity across countries. We have seen classic success stories, but there are new success stories. Mozambique, post independence, has done amazingly. Ghana, Rwanda, I mentioned already. Even non-resource-rich countries we have seen growing fast due to improvement in agriculture, in the service sector, which I will return to. But there are growth concerns in the case of the DRC, for example, Zimbabwe. So on the bottom, we still have lots of challenges to deal with. Now, I mentioned the problem of volatility. If you look at growth over time in African countries, what has been difficult for African countries not to achieve high growth. That they can do any day. The problem has been to maintain and sustain high growth. If you look at one particular sector, which is very important, if we're going to think about transformation, even as we think about transformation, agriculture must cover the base. You need to feed your people, even as you think about industrialization. And what I see here is agriculture driving that high volatility of growth because of the lack of productivity progress in agriculture, lack of innovation in agriculture, rain-fed predominantly agriculture. So it's very exposed to external shocks. So we need to figure out how to, first of all, get a more productive agriculture that could lift the levels of income for the rural sector, but also feed the growing urban population. As we see in African countries, urban expansion is increasing. But for this, we need agriculture that's more productive and more stable. Now, this shows you clearly that concentration of production has been a concern for African countries. And when you look at impact on growth, it is the case that, looking at this is only African countries, there is no evidence that actually diversification is going to give you high growth rate. No. But there is clear evidence that diversification is going to give you more stable growth. So, one of the reasons why we are talking so much about transformation is to get African countries to get a broader base of their production system, which is going to allow them to buy, as I say here, a more stable growth. Dr. Lin was talking about how China was pretty much comparable to sub-Saharan Africa a few decades ago, but now has taken off in terms of income. And here I have an illustration with only two countries, Gabon and Korea. In fact, in the 60s, Gabon was started at higher growth rate, a higher income, But you can see now that even though Gabon, in the context of Africa, is considered as the more wealthier countries, it's the gap between Gabon and Korea has increased very significantly. So you could say that maybe Korea started better off. No, it didn't. So Gabon has to run faster to catch Korea. I think it's not that if you're going to run and the other guy is the motorbike, you have no chance to catch them. So we need to rethink about production systems in African countries to be able to bridge that gap. It can't just be doing the same thing over and over again. And one of the key differences between the two countries is industrialization. Look at manufacturing value added for Korea and Gabon. Basically, Gabon, you can say flat, if you don't want to say declining, but you can see how Korea has increased the share of manufacturing in GDP. And for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, basically the trend is declining. Granted, there are countries which are doing well, but overall, the manufacturing is not growing. So we need to figure out, first of all, how the ones that are making good progress, how are they doing it? There is a way of, there is a case for African countries to learn actually from African countries, from other African countries. Even as Dr. Lin was saying that you need to look at the country that's ahead of you so you can catch, they have the same features, but sometimes that country is just next door. So it's a matter of trying to figure out what they are doing that's actually working. I was talking about the case of Rwanda, for example. The good things that they're doing in improving value added in the coffee sector. The countries around Rwanda can learn from what Rwanda is doing. Now, taking the long view again, the other evidence you see is that is a cross-country diversity in terms of performance. Once again, one thing that this can tell us is that there are things that African countries can learn among themselves. The other question is how do we, should we focus on finding out what the top is doing so that we can do better, or should we also spend our energy finding out what's not what's not working on the bottom so that we can lift them up? Because as income is not growing, in this case it's shrinking, there are serious concerns about stability, political stability, social stability. So that's why we need to worry about why these countries are actually shrinking while others are growing. And as I said, in the case of African countries, even as we celebrate high growth, one thing that we have to worry about is that poverty really has not declined significantly. Depending on which way you look at it, from 1980 to 2005, poverty has declined dramatically from 58% of the population in poverty to 50, or really not much gain from 53 to 50. And this is even as countries were growing fast. And reading the evidence, one of the key concerns is inequality. In addition to the fact that we need to look at the sources of growth, which is driven by capital-intensive sectors and so on, but even in countries where it's not oil, where it's not resources, inequality is a key constraint to poverty reduction. So we need to figure out how to bring in the poor, bring in the marginalized segments of the population into the mainstream economy. When I joined the African Development Bank, one of the studies that I found on my desk was a study on unemployment in Tunisia. The study to me, was very well done. And the conclusions were very clear, some of them not surprising, that there's a growing number of graduates who are having a hard time finding jobs, that there is a growing gap between the wages of graduate male, graduate female, whereas females earn less for comparable education, have a harder time finding jobs, but the government refused to get the study published. I went back and cleaned every language and made it, ironed the corners and so on. No way. And 2 years later, the government was undone because of this problem of unemployment of the youth. So this is from the same study. At that time, I could not have used this data to make the presentation. But you can see clearly that while unemployment has not increased, overall unemployment has not increased significantly in the case of Tunisia, there is a rising ratio of unemployment for the graduates. Okay? And this is a case where it's a country that has done an amazing job in terms of education. Literacy rates are maybe 100. I mean, it's very, very high. Gender parity is very, very high. And the government had moved even from universal elementary education to almost universal high school education, and even to graduate education, building, establishing master's degrees, PhDs, and so on. So in terms of human capacity, human skills, human capital development, they have done an amazing job. What has missed is to think about the demand side. So you have the supply of skills, what is happening on the supply side and how you match them. And this was a major failure of the system in the sense of, in terms of accommodating and being able to absorb the new graduates into the labor market. So it's a lesson. It has been a very hard lesson. I was there during the revolution. It was scary, but of course it was a momentous event in the history of Tunisia. But at the same time, the youth these days, because the youth is more educated, is demanding more than just jobs. It's also demanding voice. It's demanding respect. If you have followed the history of Tunisia and the revolution again, was because this youth was not only unemployed, but had been frustrated by lack of attention from the government. They felt as if they didn't matter. And if they didn't matter, it was as well not was a life that was not worth living. So we need to worry about youth unemployment in general, but youth unemployment. As we try to develop education, there's a sense that we need to figure out how we develop a private sector that can absorb this growing number of educated youth. Another issue which was emphasized is the issue of infrastructure deficit. There is no way we're going to achieve structural transformation unless we have a viable and good infrastructure. And in the case of African countries, it's documented that the financing inflows for infrastructure are vastly inadequate, huge infrastructure gap. But these days now we have to not only think about improving, scaling up infrastructure, but actually scaling up in a sustainable fashion, which requires us to think about a new investment model in the infrastructure sector. So if we're going to provide energy, how do we do it? We have to use the resources we have now, but think about moving gradually to a low carbon path in the future. It may not be possible now, which means that African countries are going to use, of course, coal for fueled energy, but improving the quality, reducing the pollution impact of those resources, so that we can move to higher supply of energy, lower pollution in the long run. We have to think about, we do this because we are worried about climate change. All the analysis shows that, in fact, less developed countries suffer disproportionately higher impact of climate change because they have less capacity to absorb, to adapt, and less capacity to innovate. When the rain doesn't come, or when there is a storm, when there is hail, the rural farmers suffer dramatically because they have no cushion. So climate change must be part of our thinking in terms of structural transformation and scaling up infrastructure for accelerated growth. Two central questions for Africa then are, there are many, but I want to highlight two of them. I said Africa has achieved growth but not enough, reduced poverty but not enough, high inequality constraining growth, which means can we then quickly raise growth, reduce inequality, and reduce poverty? That's the challenge for African countries. Because if you raise growth enough, maybe you can reduce poverty if you do nothing about inequality. But that requires very, very high growth rates, which means that the best way to conquer poverty is to actually to act on both fronts, raising growth and reducing inequality at the same time. The second one is on industrialization. Somebody asked the question about whether the current global environment is conducive to industrialization for African countries. It's a key challenge. So there has to be a clear national strategy that incentivizes discovery. As Justin was saying, each country must examine its own potentials, comparative advantage, which means that the government's role is there to incentivize discovery of those activities that for Burkina Faso, for Congo, for Togo, are going to harness comparative advantage. At the same time, once the new industries are found, how do you nurture them? Because again, in the context of open trade, certainly new African industries are going to have a hard time competing against Chinese industries, Indian industries, European industries. How do you do that? How do you do that? And then developing markets. I think there is more that African countries can do to tap into domestic markets. I was talking about expanding urban sectors. This is something that can accommodate new products, but you have to think about the African consumer is a new consumer now. Young, educated, high-tech. It's no longer a traditional consumer. So you have to have creative, innovative industries to satisfy the demands of that sector, of that new demand. So elements of us strategy for structural change, I have to go back to agriculture. I think with still high population growth rates, expanding urban centers, you need an agriculture which is productive to be able to feed the growing population. And then you can do other things. But I think agriculture is the starting point. Then managing resources. We have talked about moving up the value chain, but I want to emphasize one particular thing, which is what I call a responsible private sector. My belief, based on the evidence I see, is that African countries are being shortchanged in terms of what they get out of their resources. They sign very unbalanced rent-sharing contracts where the multinational companies get the bulk of the proceeds and countries keep less. And why is that? One of the reasons is capacity. Dr. Lottie was talking about capacity to manage. You think of Shell descending in a country like Equatorial Guinea. Shell has very good lawyers, very good accountants, very good technicians to think about what contract gets the maximum out of the deal for Shell. I don't think Equatorial Guinea has as much talent in terms of designing these complex contracts, which look at the future, the current prices, and so on. So if we're thinking about helping African countries to better manage resources, we need to think about how to invest more in skills development for these countries to be able to manage their resources. Then managing what I call patient transitions. First of all, when you look at African countries' performance, you do see that the service sector is taking a larger and larger share of GDP, about 40% now in many countries. But the question is that a sustainable growth model, how many jobs are we creating in those services? What are these services anyway? Okay. Is it these formal enterprises, small enterprises? The data we just saw now here is that the private sector is mostly small and medium enterprises. And what I know from the evidence again is that that sector tends to experience very high death rates. Small enterprises have a hard time growing and have a hard time surviving. So before we get comfortable of a model where growth in Africa is going to be driven by services, we need to figure out what are we getting out of those services in terms of employment and income. And also income, the wages, to figure out how much wages they pay. The other one is low growth, going to a low growth path, low carbon growth path. Again, this has to be a long-term perspective where African countries are investing both in generation, using the resources that they have, but also in improving technology to minimize pollution. Then in terms of strategy, Dr. Lin showed us the long view of development thinking. What we want to do is avoid the same mistakes. And to me, one of the mistakes that was done in the past is what I call counterproductive dichotomies, where we thought that the market did not serve us well, so let's remove them and put the state. The state is going to do everything. The state did not do us good, so let's remove the state, shrink the state, and leave everything to the market. And we know it doesn't work. For a strong growth strategy must foster efficient markets, because they are very good for competition, discovery, and so on. But you need also a strong, capable state that's going to deal with market failures, to harness the private sector. Then also, again, another counterproductive dichotomy between domestic markets and trade. You need both. And as I said, there is room for African countries to grow their domestic markets, both nationally and also regionally, even as they try to penetrate, to tap into the global markets. Another dichotomy is domestic resource mobilization and productive foreign capital. Domestic resource mobilization, my sense is that we tend to underestimate the capacity of African countries to raise savings. I remember a couple of years ago when the government of Kenya issued an infrastructure bond, a domestic infrastructure bond, which was oversubscribed. And yet we think of African countries, low income, low savings. No, if you are creative enough, you can mobilize a lot of savings in African countries, yes. Somebody asked about a sector which had been missed out, which was the civil society. No, I don't think, I mean, Dr. Lin emphasized a lot in terms of the role of institutions, and that's, to me, all that fits into the role of institutions in terms of improving governance, monitoring, and so on. So in this case, my point is that for us to achieve all that, we will need to pay attention to what we need for African countries to develop into more stable regimes. Because you can build anything you want. If it's built on a fragile institutional base, it will collapse in 2 days. It may take 20 years to double income. It takes 2 days to destroy the whole thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dikumana. Very, very comprehensive overview. I have the privilege and honor to introduce Ditya Matu, who is the research manager for the Trade and International Integration Unit at the World Bank, of which I'm a part of. I consider him a friend, but he's my boss. So we have one of the world's leading experts in the services sector and an eminent trade economist with us here today. So Aditya, please.
Thank you very much, John. For those of you who have the privilege of knowing John, you'll realize that nobody can be John's boss. John is, in fact, our ambassador both to your university and to the United Nations. And I'm grateful to him, not just for having brought me here, but for giving me the privilege of listening to such wonderful, thought-provoking presentations. Thank you very much. I have also the privilege of being the last speaker, so I have to keep you awake and be brief. So I'll make 3 quick points. Well, they won't be very quick, but I'll try and consolidate here some of the research that people in my colleagues at the bank have done. It is research which is done by collecting a lot of primary data, often in collaboration with think tanks and universities in developing countries. We disseminate this data. This new initiative that the bank has taken under our president and Justin's leadership means that this data is a public good almost as soon as it's collected. We often do research in collaboration with other institutions, and we are welcome opportunities to sort of try and see results being implemented in collaboration as well. So I think what we have seen today, that the pattern of international integration is changing, and it offers remarkable new opportunities for least developed countries. But it also creates a greater policy challenge. In this changing world, how do we take advantage of these opportunities of the way that Justin described? And finally, what can the world do by way of international cooperation in a world where Doha has become a metaphor for stalled multilateralism? What can we reasonably expect collective action to deliver? So let me begin by showing you a picture. This is, on the vertical axis, you have growth rates of exports, and on the horizontal axis, you have growth rates of GDP. The circled dots are the least developed countries. The uncircled dots are other countries in the world. And this is a picture of the 1980s. This is a picture of the 1990s, and this is a picture of the 2000s. So something interesting is happening. This whole set of points is shifting up into the positive quadrant. And what's remarkable, that for about 170 countries for which we have data, as many as 160 have shown positive real growth of exports. This is unprecedented. Now, part of this story is that the nature of trade is changing. Products, goods, and services are becoming fragmented. So it doesn't matter now if you can't make a whole automobile. You can specialize in making tires or carburetors. And that by itself has created new opportunities. We heard about services. It doesn't matter if you can't produce a full-fledged integrated accountancy services. You can do bookkeeping in Kenya. You can do design making in another, like in Colombia. So in a sense, there are new opportunities, and it is also true that information is now traveling more widely, faster than ever before. So perhaps there is also greater technological convergence that underlines this phenomenon. So there's fragmentation and there's technological convergence. But there's another story which might be behind this picture, and that might be that this is really about Chinese growth and the tide of Chinese growth which is lifting all boats. How much is this growth driven by the kind of structural transformation that we have heard about, and how much of it is just an increased demand for the natural resources that the rest of the world is producing? I think that disentanglement is something that we are just beginning to do, because that is critical. As you showed a few minutes ago, how sustainable is this phenomenon will depend critically, as Justin said, if this is real evidence of structural transformation. Let's look at the trade policy picture. Again, 1980s, tariffs on the horizontal axis, just for convenience, GDP per capita. 1990s, 2000s. So the conventional protection is declined dramatically. Average tariffs now in developing countries are closer to 10%, when in 1990 they were 30%. So here is a world where trade is growing as never before, where the conventional barriers to trade have disappeared, is trade policy passé? Am I now suggesting that our species is about to become extinct because there's nothing for us to do? Perhaps not, because there are, as I said, new challenges. First of all, we heard a lot about countries and what is happening to export performance. But we must remember that countries don't export, firms do. And we are creating a new database in the World Bank, which is for the first time bringing together firm-level export transaction data. And this is beginning to help us understand what drives export success. We have 40 countries, 10, 11 of which are least developed countries. And some really unexpected, perhaps you always knew this, but one thing that emerges is that across the world, not just in the least developed countries, but even in relatively sophisticated countries like Chile, a very few firms dominate exports. For example, in Burkina Faso and Tanzania, more than 60% of all exports come from the top 1% of exporters. Now that begins to raise a question, that if there is a case for targeted, limited support, should it be given to the small and medium enterprises which sort of pull at our heartstrings and are politically really important, who need the support but will never probably be able to use it? Or should you give it to these large firms who can use it, but perhaps don't need it? So even as we begin to consider proactive action, there are now interesting questions. For example, some research has suggested that we must target the marginal firm, the firm that with this little nudge that you were suggesting might actually go from becoming a non-exporter to an exporter. But then there is another striking fact. We always believed it's really hard to start exporting. It turns out that there is actually a very large amount of entry into exporting. But very few firms survive. So the experimentation, the volatility chart that you showed is really interesting, because you get lots of firms selling for 1 year. 1 year later, many of them have disappeared. So again, if we are now to try and support entry into trade, the conventional trade fairs, the first piece of information, the externalities that prevent people from knowing where the market is and so on, is where all the action was. But what about helping firms persist to sustain their growth? What instruments are appropriate for that challenge? These are the questions that we are struggling with. And if there is a case for proactive intervention, this is the kind of evidence we need to get in order to design our interventions better than we did in the past. This is something that I'll come back to in a minute. Let me give you a few examples of the policy situation. Now, one of the big issues, and Ambassador Acharya and others have spoken about this in the past, is creating an external environment which is conducive to growth by eliminating the barriers that impede exports from the least developed countries. Now, interesting research by my colleagues suggests that the tariffs have indeed disappeared. And this duty-free, quota-free might well be close to a reality, though even there is a certain grudging aspect to it. But the non-tariff barriers, so we took a selection of countries, like, for example, Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh's case, the tariff equivalent of the non-tariff barriers they face, non-tariff barriers is import inspection requirements, burdensome standards which you are obliged to conform. For example, John's path-breaking work showed that aflatoxin standards on groundnuts and so on had the effect of really destroying exports in a lot of African countries. So those increasingly burdensome standards, inspection requirements, technical standards, both in manufacturing and agriculture, are becoming a bigger impediment to exporting. And how you actually sift between the standard, which is a legitimate expression of the desire for health and safety, and the standard, which is a disguised restriction on trade, purely protectionist, is again a hugely difficult task. The exchange rate. Again, very interesting work from my colleagues. On the left-hand side, you have a picture of the exchange rate centered around the notional year 0, before which it was relatively overvalued and then it depreciated significantly. This is developed countries, developing countries. And this is a picture of surges in manufacturing exports. And what do you see? The surge is defined as a sustained growth over a significant period of time. That the periods of depreciated, we can say undervalued exchange rate, invariably preceded the export surge. So that ties in also with this whole natural resource question, because if you export a lot of natural resources, that causes an appreciation of your exchange rate and could render your manufacturing sector less competitive. Many economists believe that China, constrained by the rules of the World Trade Organization since in the year when it exceeded around 2001, has used the exchange rate as an instrument of industrial policy. Now, whether that is true or not is an open question, but certainly it is a powerful instrument. Whether it is a positive instrument, I don't know. But the fact that overvalued exchange rates can really inhibit the development of the manufacturing sector as a negative instrument, there is no doubt. John's work has shown that when we look beyond these policy instruments, the business environment, the physical infrastructure themselves impose a tax on African exporters. For example, in a country like Cameroon, the physical infrastructure imposes a tax of almost an ad valorem tax of 40%. Now, physical infrastructure is a hard question, because one mistake my friend John makes, and I keep arguing with him, is you have to also look at the cost of building the road. You can't just look at how hard it is. But where he has a more powerful point is the business environment. The stroke of the pen reform. Again, in Cameroon, the ad valorem equivalent of the poor business environment, the fact that you need many more licenses, as much as 16, 17%. So here again, we must keep these things in perspective. Even as the LDCs seek improved access to foreign markets, they must find ways of dealing with the implicit taxes that are imposed on production at home. The bank is recognizing this. Somebody asked, how is the bank changing? The old days of conditionality and coercion have fortunately disappeared. The bank's trade agenda now focuses much more, first of all, on trade competitiveness, on building the kind of capacity that Ambassador Acharya was talking about, productive capacity, equipping agriculture, manufacturing, and services producers to export. Secondly, there is much more emphasis now in bank lending, bank projects, on trade facilitation and logistics to reduce the transactions costs that Justin spoke about. If you look at the bank portfolio, a huge part of it is trade facilitation, a huge part of it is trade competitiveness, trade policy and regulations. The old sort of bogey of conditionalism has perhaps fortunately shrunk to 2%. But there is a problem. And that is, I think, a problem that all assistance has had and has never seriously confronted. That when these projects are implemented, the evaluative component is incredibly weak. We surveyed 85 World Bank projects. And if this is happening of World Bank projects, I would conjecture it's even more true of national projects or bilateral projects. Only 3/4 of them were evaluated. And most of them were impressionistic evaluation. 2 people went to the firm and things looked much better than they were before. or simple before and after. That before they weren't exporting much, now they're exporting much more, therefore our project is a success. This is simply not credible. Especially in trade, we've missed the bus on evaluation. If you're competing for scarce assistance in increasingly skeptical developed communities in developed industrial countries where their taxpayer money is being devoted to it, we need to do a better job of demonstrating that this assistance is actually producing results. And not only for that, we need evaluation to happen also to inform the interventions. We need to learn by doing in a way that we haven't done. Let me give you an example. We are doing this work on Tunisia. Tunisia had a famous FAMEX program designed to encourage exports. And if you look at the first few years, now this is a three-dimensional picture, what you see here is the increase over time in the products that are exported, in the countries to which you export, and the overall volume of exports. This is the year that you had the intervention. Now, if you stopped after 1 or 2 years, you would come away with an incredible success story. Tunisian firms which benefited sold more new products to more countries and a much higher value of exports. But then we tracked it over time. And there's an interesting picture that emerges, that diversification survived, value of exports did not. But that raises an interesting question. Could it be that by giving firms incentives to sell new products to new markets, you were actually inducing them to over-diversify in a way that caused them to move away from whatever their core competence was in a way that was not sustainable? But my point is not to draw either a positive or a negative lesson. It is true, as you said, that maybe diversification reduced volatility, and that is a benefit. It could be that we can intervene in more sophisticated, more targeted ways along the lines that Justin suggested, to reduce transaction costs, to reduce the information failures that prevent firms from venturing into exporting in the first place. My point is, whatever we do, we need better evidence because we are not innocent. We have seen intervention before, and we have huge examples of the kind that Justin mentioned, of capture, inefficiency, corruption. So if we are going to now follow this new fashion of aid for trade, let us resolve to do it in a way that is more credible, more effective, and delivers what we really want it to deliver. We heard services mentioned, and I think I'll just talk about this for a few minutes. We've again built a new database of services policies. For the first time, we actually know what countries do to inhibit trade in services. And here are the least developed countries in red. Some of them, either thanks to the bank's efforts or because they acceded to the WTO, were induced to really liberalize their services sectors. Others, like Ethiopia, have clung on to monopolies in telecommunications, in banking, and so on. So you have a large amount of diversity among least developed countries. But there's something really interesting that struck us, that the landlocked countries actually, whether it's Ethiopia or Zimbabwe or Rwanda or even Botswana, have more restrictive policies in telecommunications and in air transport than the average developing country. So the very services that connect landlocked countries with the rest of the world are in fact more restricted in landlocked countries than elsewhere. So there are 2 or 3 interesting things that emerge. First, you see, you're used to thinking of the landlocked as victims of geography. But we must also recognize that some constellation of political forces is producing more perverse policy choices. Now, that might be because the rents that can be appropriated are greater in landlocked countries because people don't have an outside option. They don't have a ship. They're trapped by the airline. there's also the question of what would aid for trade do? You build ports, you build new infrastructure, but if you don't have competition between airlines to use those services, a lot of the benefits of the improved infrastructure can be appropriated by the oligopolies which flourish in air transport. And that is a problem, because the transaction cost reduction that Justin spoke about will not happen with pure infrastructure. It needs to be accompanied by meaningful competition. Services reform, in fact, might be the most powerful form of trade facilitation. We have looked at the pricing and quality of services that are available and linked it to this new index. And we see that there is a strong link that countries which have more open services sectors tend to have lower transactions costs and better quality of logistics services. Even industrial policy. This is work we did on India, which suggests that before we contemplate actually providing assistance, let's at least stop handicapping firms. India's manufacturing revival has traditionally been attributed to trade liberalization in manufacturing. Our research suggests that the biggest kick for Indian manufacturers came not from liberalization of licensing and trade in goods, but the reforms in services. Better access to transport, better access to telecom, better access to financial services has in fact led to much greater productivity increase in manufacturing. So in a sense, the services agenda which you mentioned as a potential for export, even the transactions cost of participating in a country like Zambia, for example, which has Zika, which is the most successful institute for producing chartered accountants, not in Africa, perhaps in the world. They have higher pass rates than anywhere else. Why is Zambia not able to take advantage of that to participate in this outsourcing boom? One of the reasons was the persistence of a monopoly in telecom, which made Zambian costs of telecommunications much higher than in any other country. So in a sense, even the services agenda is contingent on services reform. And that's why I think the Zambian case study, if I can just quickly point to, shows us that past reform often led to perverse outcomes. Either thanks to the bank or the fund, or to the domestic political economy, countries in Africa rushed to liberalize in the very sectors like banking, where there was need for better complementary regulation. In agriculture, Alan Winter's work has shown very powerfully how when you have a domestic agricultural sector which is handicapped by poor transport services, poor credit services, poor input services, and you liberalize agricultural trade, you cause farmers to go bankrupt, they cannot stay in the market, and then when you improve the services later, they don't come back because all that production knowledge is lost. So how you sequence reform is critical. But there are other areas where a country like Zambia could have reformed. Zambia had the courage to let its national airline go bankrupt. Switzerland is one of the few other countries which did that. But they still protect. They still don't grant what are called fifth freedom rights. It's as if they are protecting an imaginary airline. So the Kenyan airline, the Ethiopian airline doesn't have fifth freedom rights to fly from Lusaka to, say, Johannesburg or Harare. And that in a country which wants to compete with Tanzania in tourism, which has potential in horticulture. So these are the kind of, I think, perverse policy choices that we need to think. But if I can turn to, I think, something that I agree overwhelmingly with, and I would love to hear Justin's view also, that there's no doubt that you have increasing inequality. In a way, in a country like Zambia, you had a period of colonialism with all the services were concentrated in urban areas. Then you had a period of Kondayan socialism, where you used instruments to at least try and spread access to services more widely. But the instruments were inefficient. They led to a huge macroeconomic problems. That followed the bank fund liberalization, where you saw liberalization, but you didn't see instruments designed to ensure that the gains from liberalization would be spread widely. And I think that has given liberalization a bad name in many countries. So we need to think harder about efficient policies to widen access to services so we don't get this inequality that you're talking about. Unfortunately, there are powerful examples from countries like Chile, which have used universal access funds to try and encourage both private entry and competition, as well as improved access to services across the board. And we need to think harder about this. In terms of, to conclude, multilaterally, I think we do need to create a better environment by pushing harder for true duty-free, quota-free, not that -3%, which takes away a lot of its benefits. But we also need to address non-tariff barriers. In agriculture, we need to do more to prevent countries from imposing export restrictions. My colleague Will Martin has done remarkable work showing how these export restrictions that countries impose. India has just imposed an export restriction in cotton. In fact, as much as half the surge in rice prices in 2008 was not because of shortages. It was because countries like Vietnam and India imposed export restrictions. And that really hurts least developed countries. And finally, in services, I do believe that that must be the heart of both the trade facilitation agenda and the industrial policy agenda. Services reform is critical. We must think of ways in which we can have greater assistance and greater reform. And finally, I do emphasize what I said, that even as we think of new aid for trade, it must be accompanied by rigorous impact evaluation so that we can intervene in a way that is genuinely effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aditya. A wide overview of the trade landscape and enthusiasm of an artistry of delivery. Please, let's now turn it over to the audience. If you could please identify yourself and any questions, we'll go back here first. For any and all of our panelists.
Some of this is already done, some of it is
international finance student. My question was to Dr. Freni, just leveraging what Dr. Lin said in his book about employing the endowment to come up with competitive advantage. How do you think, and you said about the diasporas and the remittances, how do you think you could link those two to come up with a strategy to actually employ the wider diasporas and not only remittances, but the technical skills and the network itself to come up with a driver as one of the endowments?
Let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll go to maybe a second round. Please, here, madam.
Thank you. My name is Kumeya Lubali. I want to thank the panelists for their comprehensive presentation. My question, I want to know how to improve education regarding the economic growth actually. I mean, in Togo, for example, a few high schools or colleges can provide skills to the young people to give them the opportunity to get easily the employment. And in my point of view, taking account economic and education, I think it's necessary to review the education system or the education reform regarding the economic actually. Thank you.
Okay. Back here, and then there. Please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Anant. I'm from Brookings. My question is pretty much to all the speakers. Since all of them touched upon the subject, what do you see first? Should there be political reform or should there be economic reform? The question is, which influences the other? If you have just economic exploitation, you have the Dutch problem, and political reform, which is not backed by an economic agenda, starts to concentrate power in a few people. So should the World Bank take any measures with respect to that kind of political reform? And if it should, then what do you suggest? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it was here, please. Sir.
Hi, my name's Andrew Sieber, a CEPA student. My question goes to the public sector. We heard a lot about policies, but I didn't hear much about public sector reform and building capacity within the public sector. So a lot of the things we talked about today required competencies and coordination with the public sector. For instance, if you're doing evaluation of trade projects, would it be better to train the public sector within these developing countries to do that? Thanks.
Okay, and then we will take one question back here, and then we'll do a second round. How's that? Please.
Thank you. I am Umar Diallo from the United Nations. I have one question on the growth identification that was highlighted by Dr. Lin, but the question also applies, to the panelists. How do you select or pick up new industry sectors when your country comparator, have like the comparative advantage and relative price, distorted or blurred, by some intervention? How do you go about in that particular case? What do you do?
Okay, thank you. I think the first question was for Franny. Please.
Thank you for the question on how do you use endowments which include the diaspora and go beyond remittances to also tap into the skills and networks. I think this is one of the most opportune areas that one could look at, especially given the size of the diaspora and what they have learned. In fact, if you look at India and China, a lot of the new ideas and the transformations that took place in India and China came from Indians and Chinese who came back to their countries with these new ideas, linked up to networks outside of their countries of origin and advanced in incredible ways. The IT sector in India is a good example, pharmaceutical as well. And I think this would link up to the question of education, because a lot of the investments in education have gone towards creating what was considered what you need for the economy today, but without doing the kind of analysis that Dr. Lin suggested, which is you look at what should be the areas that you should advance, whether it's for comparative advantage purposes or latent advantage that you can tap into in the next 5 to 10 years. And you notice that the majority of countries that have invested in educating people at the higher level did not do that. So you have a lot of people with degrees in literature, but not enough books being sold and read in the domestic economies, and very few being exported. Very few investments in the basic vocational skills that would be very important for the early stages of manufacturing, and no link to the science and technology that would pull everything up. So I think we have done a very poor job, in my view, in terms of tertiary education. And South Korea is a more recent country that seems to have done a much, much better job in this. And the last question I will tackle, because I know we've all been asked the same questions, but the other panelists would have perhaps a better response on this. What I took away from Dr. Lin's presentation is a shift in strategy. Because previously, what we would do, you'd say, what do I want to achieve? What do I need to do to get there? And then what will I get when I do what I need to do to get there? Which puts strategy in a very forward-thinking way, but thinking about the results chain and what you need to do in the interim. But when you look at the proposal that he has put in his new book, I like to think of it as, what do I have? What can I do with it? And if I do it right, what will I get? And this is a completely different way of thinking, because you start with your endowments and the things that you have available. And I think if we apply this to the education sector, and if we use that to make choices on the sequencing of policy that Dr. Mato just told us about, we would have a much better set of choices to support in the LDCs. And I think this is how I would like to end. I'm very sorry, I have a flight to catch and I need to run. That's why I wanted to answer this particular question now, because I won't be here to answer any others that you may have. So I'm very sorry about that.
Understood. Thank you very much, Franny, and a pleasure to have you with us. Let's move to the. Let's move to our other panelists to pick up. I know there was a question on, is it, political reform or economic reform? Maybe Dr. DiCumana could weigh in on that. It's sort of one of the big ticket questions, I suppose.
Yes. The question is a legitimate and very pertinent one, because, as I indicated in my presentation, we have seen cases where political instability destroys things that have been built over decades. So, and that's what I was meaning by avoiding the temptation of building economic prosperity at the expense, at the cost of political freedom. So, and we have seen progress in African countries in terms of openness in the political space. And as I said, this is also something that African countries can learn from each other in terms of what is working and how it is working. What you don't want to see is regimes clinging on power at the expense of freedom, and you know that the consequences can be dramatic. I don't think there is a sequence issue. You don't say, let's reform the economy and develop enough before we open up the political space. I think that's the wrong approach to take. I think political freedom is something that needs to be nurtured even as countries are designing their economic strategy. And the way you do that is open the policy space to the public, starting with things that are doable. I can give an example in terms of public fiscal policy management. I was in Uganda once doing a study, and I really liked the idea of the fact that fiscal policy making was open, whereas where the Ministry of Finance went through a sequence of sharing the budget with academics, with civil society before they go into parliament. Because what has been frustrating for the public in African countries is that the business of the government is seen as no-go zone, where the public doesn't have a say, doesn't even have information about what's going on. Let's open up the political space, into the policy-making space for the public to participate. Let me just say one thing about the public sector reform. I think in addition to public sector reform, what we need to also think is developing capacity to manage policies. One thing I liked many things about Korea is what I see as a circular flow of expertise between government and academics and research, where you see former government officials going into the think tanks and back in the government, whereas in Africa, unfortunately, what you see is a movement. It's a one-way movement. You have academics and researchers and technicians. They go in government, and that's it. So you don't have that kind of feedback between knowledge generation and dissemination and policy making. I think, again, counterproductive dichotomy is when we see walls between the government and the private sector. That's where things start getting wrong.
Ditya, I think there was a reference to trade.
I just wanted to say that when you said that you don't see people going between the private sector and government, when I look at what happens in the United States in financial regulation, I worry about the revolving door becoming too. So I just want to say a few things about the questions that were raised. One, there is a new ABCD, the Bank Annual Conference on Development Economics under Justin's leadership and assisted by my colleague Asli, which is precisely on the subject of transparency and accountability. And I think it's a great conference and a great program when it comes out, so I would encourage you all to follow that. Another quick observation on making the most of diaspora. My colleague Dilip Ratha, under the leadership of our Vice President, has been thinking about these diaspora bonds and other instruments, and they might be worth sort of exploring. If I can make two slightly trickier points. One is about this education, and unfortunately Franny's not here. I think there's a real problem of working with inherited systems of education. For example, you know, we did a study in Mozambique where we find that all the doctors who are trained have either left Mozambique or are in the cities. But Mozambique had a new degree. It was called a non-physician, non-clinician physician, a sort of paramedic. And these paramedics, first of all, are more appropriately priced. They're like the Chinese barefoot doctor in a sense. I don't know if he still exists, but I think one big problem is that these paramedics are more affordable because they can deal with 95% of the problems, health problems that arise in the proximate. And second, they don't emigrate because they don't have such a big difference in the kind of salaries that they can earn in urban areas and so on. So I think thinking harder about appropriate standards and resisting the tyranny of harmonization in a sense, I think is really important. On the political economy, I think it's a little bit a chicken and egg, but I think it's not fashionable, but I think the Marxist insights into the dialectics between the sort of superstructure and the mode of production, I think are critical. And I think there's one interesting thing which I've noticed looking at, for example, the persistence of monopolies in telecom or refineries, say in Zambia, that I think economists are used to doing a political economy where you say, supposing there's a reform that will increase the size of the cake, why can't we compensate the current powerful person who's resisting reform? And I think it raises an interesting question. In some societies, you're willing to do that compensation even though it is an illegitimate beneficiary. If the president's wife is getting the profits or the political party is getting the profit, in this transparent systems like Zambia, it's very hard to compensate them and say, let us get on with our lives and leave the monopoly and let's introduce competition. So it's a perverse situation. Too much transparency. If you're Norway, you don't have the problem. If you're a system where you can buy out those who are resisting, you don't have a problem. But when you have some limited transparency, you can get trapped. Like in India, for example, retail reform is not possible, even though it is unquestionably better for the economy. So I think how you break these stalemates, perhaps is one of the biggest problems.
Very good. Justin, please.
I'd like to respond to the question.
Yes.
I'd like to respond to the question raised at the last. You have all kind of distortion and distort the relative price and so on. And under that kind of situation, how do you implement the approach I recommend? This kind of new structural approach to promote structural changes. Certainly, there are two approaches, which has been debated in the 1980s and 1990s, when the socialist country, they move away from the planning economy to the market economies. In effect, not only in a socialist country, because in the 1980s, when a lot of developing countries encounter all kinds of crises due to the structuralist industrial policy in the past. And those kind of industrial policies always create many kind of distortion in nature or very similar to the intervention distortion in a socialist planning economy. And the conventional wisdom is that if we have so many distortions, then you need to remove all those distortions in order to that market works. And that was the Washington consensus type of liberalization approach. But if you look into those countries adopt those kind of approach, in general, their performance were not good, because all kind of distortion create, protection to certain type of non-viable firm in the priority sectors. In general, they employ a lot of workers, especially the country pursue those kind of strategies for a long time. And if you remove all those kind of distortions, then they are going to go bankrupt. They are going to create a huge unemployment and a social instability, political instabilities. And in many countries fulfills all those kind of consequences after introduce the Washington consensus type of reform. In general, government reintroduce a lot of other protection and subsidies in a disguised way. And those kind of disguised protection and subsidies sometimes were even less efficient than the old protection and subsidies. And if you look into the successful transition economy, like China in the 1980s, Vietnam also in the 1980s, and in effect, not only the successful transitional economy like China, Vietnam, like Mauritius in the 1970s, when they started to move away from the import substitution or structuralist approach. They all adopt, for some I call, the dual track approach. In the dual track approach, in general, they continue to provide some kind of transitionary protection and subsidy to the firm in the old priority sector. They did not remove that immediately. But they liberalize the entry into the sectors which they have competitive advantages. And in that kind of new sectors, they do not have much distortion. They allow the market to work. And I can give one example, not China, the Mauritius. Mauritius was considered as a hopeless case in the 1950s, 1960s. In effect, James Miller was invited, Nobel Prize winner, was invited to write a report for Mauritius in the 1950s. And he considered Mauritius was a hopeless country. Several reasons. All the factors we think that make a country fail, all exist there. Ethnic conflicts, and all kind of distortion, and a small economy far away from all the major markets, monocultures. And Mauritius, like other developing countries influenced by the structuralist ideas, also adopt the import substitution strategies with all kind of distortion and protection to a very tiny manufacturing sectors. But in 1971, they started to set up an export processing zone to attract the textile and garment sectors into Mauritius. And in that export processing zone, they liberalize all kind of regulation, wage, minimum wages and all others, and make the infrastructure good enough, business environment good enough. But they retain the old protection in other sectors domestically. But the export processing zone was so consistent with their competitive advantages, and especially attracting the textile and the garment sectors in Hong Kong and Taiwan to come. And at that time, in 1971, their per capita income measured by purchasing power parity was 50% of Hong Kong's per capita income. So just like the first step in my gross identification and facilitation in first step, those kind of sectors in Hong Kong, because of rising wage in Hong Kong and so on, they were sunset industry there. And they were attracted to make investment in Mauritius. And in Mauritius, in spite of all the distortion in other domestic sectors, they made this export processing zone, very efficient without other distortion. So I would consider, like Matu mentioned a lot about, the trade facilitation, the importance of liberalize a lot of regulation. Certainly, that should be a goal, but the goal, how to implement that. Because all kind of distortion create First, you have the political economy issue. And you also, all kind of distortion protect certain kind of firm there. And if you want to remove them altogether, I think that it's very hard to break those kind of political equilibrium. And so the partial approach of the dual track reform may offer an entry point to break those kind of equilibrium and generate the success, and the success may bring success for further reform in the futures.
Very good, thank you. I think I will take moderator's prerogative here. We have a wonderful reception downstairs in room 2, the first ground floor. We'll be showing you the way. Stay with us to continue this discussion. The Undersecretary General, I will provide the last word and say thank you all very much. Colleagues at the UN and Columbia, Hugh Patrick, Andy Wanning, Susanna Wolf, and others. So, Mr. Diarra, please, if you'd like.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, faculty members and students, distinguished panelists, let me thank all of you for having taken interest in this discussion and bringing your perspectives into the subjects that we have gone through today. We're going from here very much enriched by the discussions, the different contributions of panelists, of those who have asked questions, and that of our keynote speaker today. So we are going to adjourn this meeting. We are going to build on what we have learned here to determine the way forward in our interaction with the wider stakeholders beyond the borders of the United Nations to take on board the perspective of other actors, important actors like academia. We're going to make a synthesis of this discussion, and this will be definitely circulated so that everybody would take advantage of this. So thank you for coming again, and thank our keynote speaker and our panelists for their contribution. The meeting is adjourned.